Greetings. I count myself among that clan of writers, poets who are firmly of the belief that a writer in these times, in these enlightened times of ours, ought to, have an almost Faustian dissent for Das Druben, as we do. In fact, it is the single most important axiom that I have in my life for the past few years, for the past half a decade or so. Held quite clenched, quite firmly too, and I don't regret it. It is my belief that a writer, a poet ought to have an obsessive, have an almost non-aesthetic willingness for perfection. It is admittedly a utopian object in itself, but perfection has a charm to it. An endeavor for perfection has a charm to it that complacency cannot be expected to have. And so it is that I propound the first rule of writing. That is to say, a writer ought to have an almost Faustian dissent for Das Druben. Secondly, to those who are beginning their enterprises, writers, as professional writers, as writing professionals of any sort, must bear in mind Francis Bacon's dicta, Optimi consigliere mortui. The dead are undoubtedly the best teachers. Yes, they are, but there is a caveat to it. Undeniably, one must be wary of having books as their sole prestige. Because, for instance, if you happen to read The Venerable Bede overmuch, and if you happen to regard The Venerable Bede as a formidable prestige of yours, you must bear in mind the great vowel shift that was to happen shortly afterwards, and to give it its due consideration. Thirdly, it has been a belief I have held quite fast to for the past half a decade of my life, for the entire span of my writing life to this date, that it is absolutely essential for any thinking individual who happens to have a willingness, who happens to have a drive in them for perfection, never to embrace that cerebral asphyxia of that most peculiar sort, that most peculiar but regrettably the most common one. To be more precise, I mean to say that omit the word difficult from your dictionary. If you are predisposed, if you have a confirmation bias beforehand towards the existence of the entire notion of elusiveness, you would fall prey to that cerebral asphyxia and would never, quite regrettably, never achieve perfection. Well, none of us will ever achieve any sort of perfection in our lives. We do lead miserable, imperfect lives. But as I stated before, as I did state prior to this, an enterprise that is at its core an endeavor for perfection has more charm to it than an enterprise driven by complacency. Well, fourthly, you must be acquainted with the craft, the tools of your trade, so to say. You must be aware of what diphthongs are, you must be aware of what anapaest synonyms are, you must be able to understand to the full extent as to where voiceless fricatives, for instance, are to be used, or as to where voiced fricatives would prove more effectual. Now this is a nod to the Luddite concept of the literary arts. But I must tell you, they are helpful if you are able to understand the peculiarities, the eccentricities, the idiosyncrasies of your style or of the literary style of other writers you admire or wish to condemn. You must have a clear idea of what comprises of style, what style truly comprises of. If you do understand it, let me assure you, you would never ever in your writing life as a creative professional fall prey to that bane of the creative life, the inner turmoils, tribulations that the insecurities of the creative artist entails.